Okay, it's that time of year where people are starting to finally find out where they got into college. A little bit of heartbreak, a little bit of excitement. It can go so many different directions. And I don't know. I just feel like the whole process can be so unfair, Lisa.
Oh, it's brutal, Reena. I will tell you, we're a year out from it. Glad to have a break before we enter it again. It's hard. It's
Yeah.
hard.
This issue of unfairness never leaves you. It carries well into adulthood when you see people getting promoted that you're wondering, how did they get that? But
Yep.
how do we help our kids deal with unfairness when you know something's happened? We got this letter from a dad that really got to us. It says, Dear Dr. Lisa, my daughter just received news that she was not chosen to be an officer of the National Honor Society. While she doesn't expect to win at everything, and we've discussed dealing with losing with grace, she's struggling with the fact that one of the people who beat her out of the position regularly posts content of themselves drinking on social media. We're talking about 17-year-olds. How do I help her deal with what feels like a painfully obvious injustice? Thank you. Oh,
Hmm.
you feel it on this one, don't you? You feel it. It's a good kid who doesn't drink and do all this, but feels like the popular kid won out.
It sure does. And it's interesting, the honor society, like there's different ways that like unfairness gets distributed, right? So the honor society, from what I recall, I think this is accurate, you're elected by your peers, right?
Yes,
That
that's
that
right.
it is one of those
Yeah.
things where the officers are chosen. And of course, the irony here is it's the honor society. Like they're supposed to be role models for good behavior. And like
That's right. Yeah.
it's so I can see
Yeah.
is also why 17-year-olds are so great because they'll be like, oh my God, the irony, right? The irony of this being a kid who got chosen when they're, kind of partying and, in ways that are very flagrant, I
Yeah.
guess I would say,
Yeah.
by posting it on social media. Lots of kids drink, but there's also drinking and posting it, which are two different things.
Does this happen often? I will admit I was the president of the Honor Society back when, almost like 30 years ago, when being the president of the Honor Society was really, you are the class nerd. That's kind of what made it. But you feel the pain because it feels like this popular kid went out. Does this happen often for the Honor Society now? Do you see this?
Oh, I'm sure it happens. I'm sure it happens, right? I mean, I think this is just one of those things where, well, it's often driven by cohort. This is something I've really learned in schools is that the social dynamics can be very specific to a grade level. So sometimes people say, what do you know about so-and-so school? Is it good for, would it be a good fit for my kid? And I'll often say, well, what grade are you talking about? Because there can be grades where the nerds rule. There can be grades where the party kids rule, And it's interesting. Sometimes it comes down to just like a couple very powerful personalities, like the dynamic that arises around them. So I guess, Reena, the more accurate answer is, it really depends on the cohort. And, I was in a cohort where the nerds ruled.
Mhm.
I wasn't the lead nerd, but there were some great nerds in our cohort. And I have very vivid memories of the National Honor Society and the photos and,
Mhm.
all the
Mhm.
dressing up and,
Yeah.
so
So clearly something's changed, right? I sort of feel like, does it feel like, I feel like the Honor Society was nerds and now it's sort of pivoting, but you know what I feel? I feel the injustice of this daughter. The dad's right to write in. I mean, how can this, what can this parent say to this daughter? Because she's right. She should have gotten it, I feel, not knowing anything.
Well, and it's interesting because here's the thing that's changed. It's the posting on social media, right? Like, if I'm
Mm.
honest about the nerds, right, in my crew, there were plenty of kids who were drinking. Like, that wasn't the issue, right? There were kids who were drinking and also nerds. But where this kid is taking issue, and I think this actually is a very nuanced concern, is she's like, and they're dumb enough to put it up on, like, they're bragging
Yes,
about it in public
exactly.
spaces, right?
Exactly.
And so it's like it's not the drinking per se. It's the drinking plus putting it up in public spaces. And the key word, as I was listening to the letter, Reena, I think, and you've got it in front of you, it's like she's done it repeatedly or routinely posts. Is that like it's something, it's not just a one-off.
The people who beat her out of the position regularly post content of
Regularly post.
themselves drinking.
Okay, so that to me feels actually salient and important because here's the other thing. Good kids do dumb things, right? Like that is like if you spend any time with teenagers, like you have to work with that assumption that like a good kid can do a really dumb thing. And so if this letter had said once posted a picture on social media about
Mm-hmm.
about drinking, I would have a different reaction than the regularly.
Hmm.
Because, Rena, like, all my time with teenagers, like, I will give kids a pass to do something dumb once. Like, I will not pigeonhole a kid based on that.
Totally.
But what's interesting and I think really, really salient is not just that this kid is posting on social media about the drinking, but is doing it regularly. And I think what you and I would think with anybody is like, that's a real question about judgment,
Yes.
right? Once with a teenager, that's just being a teenager. Repeatedly doing it raises questions of judgment. And so I get it where there's this question about like, this kid is not showing good judgment on the regular. Why does that kid get to be an officer of the National Honor Society when I've got better judgment,
Yeah.
right? That's what the kid is asking.
So what do you think this dad should say? How do you approach this conversation? And what should you hit when you talk to them about this?
So again, our phenomenal letter writers, he's already talking with her about losing with grace. He's already talking with her about the way this, is part of how the world operates, I think is inherent in that. And yet he's reaching out, right? Because she's like, no, this is some baloney, right? She is really unhappy. So in terms of what to say, I think the first part is like, oh man, that stinks. That's like my favorite four
It
words in
is.
all of
Yes,
parenting.
yes.
Oh man, that
Because it's
stinks.
empathy, right? You're showing you
Yep.
understand how they feel.
Yep. And often kids are like, thank you.
Yeah.
I just needed someone to acknowledge like
Yeah.
that this is like just a grand injustice. So then I think the way, if I were sitting in this dad's shoes, I would let the kid vent a lot. I would not try to problem solve or minimize in any way because it's just going to feel like in some ways insult to injury to just be like, well, that's okay. You're great in lots of other ways. I mean, especially, and you started talking about this, like with the college stuff, this can feel very consequential, right? This question of like, I'm trying to apply to competitive colleges, and this person who I don't think deserves the position got the position I wanted. I would have wanted that on my college application. So it's not just the Honor Society role, it's the Honor Society and what it means in terms of how this kid is viewing college ambitions. So anything that doesn't account for that will come off as minimizing.
Hmm.
So I think we need to give a very wide berth for this kid to be upset and for this kid to feel like it wasn't fair. I also, Reena, think, and this is hard, a lot of parenting is just saying to kids, yeah, you know what, life's not fair. Like, happens all the time. And I'll tell you the other place I see this a lot is the kid who either doesn't come to practice that often or is dogging it at practice. Like, they're just not trying that hard, they're messing around or whatever. But they are just this natural athlete, incredibly talented, and they are starting. And it is really hard for the teammates when they are giving it everything they've got and never missing a practice and riding the bench and watching,
Mhm.
a teammate who is phoning it in at best get a starting position. And I
Yes.
think
That's so
life's not
hard.
fair.
And
Life's not
it's
fair.
so unjust, but when you come to these moments where you as a parent know, yeah, the kid's right. This is so wrong. It shouldn't happen this way. But you also know as an adult, you see this over and over again in careers, in life. What's the best thing you could tell them to prepare them for what's going to be, honestly, a lifelong exposure to injustice and things that really shouldn't be right?
Well, this is true, right? I think that's also part of why I don't want this dad rushing to reassurance or rushing to minimize it. Is it like you and I, we've been around, like you see similar stuff happen all your life, right?
Totally.
Where people you're like, wait, why'd they get that job
Yeah,
or
yeah.
why'd they get that
Yeah, but it's
promotion? Or
exactly
like,
what happened in this National Honor Society. It sounds like
yeah.
to me the popular kid, all the kids sort of supported that person and got the votes and that. And I think often you see reward based on social interactions, like so and so
Yeah.
always had drinks with so, and now that person's promoted, right? So,
Yeah.
what helps in this moment to help kids understand this issue?
Well, I think though they may not want to hear it, I think saying, yeah, here's the thing, life's not fair. And this kind of stuff, like this is something you're going to have to deal with. I mean, I just actually put it in broad perspective. They're not going to want to hear it, but it's also helpful to say, like, look, this isn't just a teenage issue. This is a life issue. Now, the other thing I want to put on the table before we go another step is this whole life's unfair thing takes on a whole other layer if you're not a person who's white, right?
So true.
That, that part of the advice, if we presume that this family is white, I have no reason to presume that, but just for the sake of argument, if we presume that this family is white, part of the advice this dad can say to the daughter is, look, it it shakes out over time. And Reena, I think you probably have seen this. Like if people are repeatedly doing things that are problematic, even if it doesn't all the way catch up with them, in my experience, it feels like it slows them down, right? Or they have to account for it in one way or another.
It always comes back.
Where
eventually.
Somehow it comes back.
Never fast enough, but it does. Never fast enough.
Exactly. Like I think like the metaphor that's coming to mind or the image that's coming to mind is like it's like a ball and chain they have to drag around. Like they're sort of dealing with it. And in my experience, people who, do really good work and they do it consistently and well and are easy to deal with and pleasant, like they just are, things move along for them in the way we would want it to. Okay. If his daughter's white, he can probably say that to her, right? He can probably say, honey, trust me. Like, I'm not saying that, turkeys don't win sometimes because they totally do. Mm-hmm. I am saying do what you're doing, keep your nose to the grindstone, be the wonderful, earnest, diligent person you are. There's, you're going to have choices and options and your path is you're going to fly. Mm-hmm. If your kid's white, that I think would be my answer. Now, needless to say, or is like, yeah, that's for people of privilege who can count on, systems accruing over time in terms of their benefit. You and I both know, you more than I know, right? That if you're a person of color, it's a steeper, it's a different scenario.
It's important to me of a teachable moment that you say could be integrated in something like this. Can we explain these things or at least put this out there so the kids see some?
So I think the way one might do it, right, is to say to this child, well, I got bad news and good news for you. Now, the bad news is you're going to see this your whole life, mm-hmm. right? Where people who don't deserve things get things and you're in competition with them and you lose out. Like that stinks. Good news is if you stick with it, if you do all the right things, if you stay on top of stuff and do good work, you will reap the profits of that and you will reap the benefits of it. I think then there's a further conversation depending on the level of privilege of the kid you're talking to, right? And so I think if you are talking to a privileged kid, you can say, and you know what? We enjoy the privilege of being white. This is going to be more true for you than most. And then if it's a child of color, I think those families have probably a developed way of talking about unfairness that is different from how I talk about it in my own home and would bring another angle entirely to questions of unfairness and questions of how well connected effort and outcome are, right? That one of the privileges of privilege is that effort and outcome stay pretty closely aligned. If you try really hard, things tend to go your way, even if they don't go your way every day all the time. And I think one thing that we can say without question is that the coupling of effort and outcome is less secure for people who aren't privileged, right? For people who navigate the world from a marginalized place where they may work very, very hard and do all the right things and the outcomes may not arrive as they should.
I want to hit on one topic before we move further, which is this concept of whether the dad or daughter should say something about the fact that the role model here, that the person you're supposed to look up to in the National Honor Society is really making bad choices. Is that worth highlighting in this conversation?
Well, it's interesting. Like if this were your kid, if this were my kid, I think part of me would be like, someone needs to know. Yeah. I mean, I think I would have that impulse of like, there are, faculty advisors to the National Honor Society, and they need to be aware that the kid who just beat out my kid, like I can pull up their social media and I can show all this naughtiness. I think that would be an impulse that almost any loving parent would have.
Yeah. Would you do it? Do you recommend?
I don't think I would.
You wouldn't recommend this dad do that and flag it to the school?
I don't think so.
Why?
I don't think so. I know, right? Why? Right? Like you really could. It's very funny. My instant response, which is a very inadequate response, is a very Midwestern, like, it's a bad look. Like it just
no, but it's true. It's like it will get, no matter what they say about confidentiality. Eventually, I feel like it would be revealed who went to the school with this, right?
Yeah, and it feels both totally earnest and understandable, and also, so then what's going to happen? Right? I mean, I think that what's the school going to do? They're going to bump the kid out of the position. Mm-hmm. because somebody came forward with evidence that this kid is not the do-gooder that they're supposed to be, right? It feels like it's, here's what I would say, Reena, here's what I would say. Feels like one of those moves that's going to have a whole lot of unintended consequences,
Ah,
right? I don't know
interesting.
what they are, but I think there's going to be, this
Mm.
is the beauty of having gotten to work closely with schools for a long time. There are so many variables at play in any scenario that you change one variable or you do something abrupt or aggressive, the downstream effects are many and hard to predict. So I think for me, I would say the object lesson is probably at home, right? Or the
Mhm.
conversation is probably at home. Like yeah, these things, you can't always make them right and you got to find a way to live with them. And you can tolerate a fairly high level of discomfort, kid. I know you can, and I'm going to help you get there. But I think acting abruptly would have consequences you couldn't see coming that you might not want. And also, and I think this is actually really important, Reena, might signal to the girl in question, the daughter, that this is more dire or more upsetting to her than she can
By
manage.
the
Right. Like,
dad taking that action to go to the school,
yeah,
it escalates at a
yeah.
level.
It does. And it's basically a vote of no confidence in the kid, right? Because, like, if you're saying at home, like, yeah, no, this totally stinks. Welcome to the world. There's a lot of unfairness. Here's how you can deal with it. And here's how I think about it as an adult who's seen it over time. You're basically saying, like, all right, kid, come my way. Like, yeah, this stinks and it's uncomfortable. And I believe you can handle that discomfort. And I believe that that can be a place where we can have a really meaningful and powerful conversation. If the parent's like, holy moly, you're upset and this is wrong and I can see it's wrong and we've got evidence, right? We've got the social media posts. And it's
Yeah.
like, I'm going to call and fix this.
Yeah.
Totally understand where it's coming from. But it's also saying, like, kid, you can't handle this. You can't
Mhm.
handle this level of discomfort. You
Yeah.
can't handle this level of distress. And Reena, we've been talking about my book, right? We've been talking about where we have to get as parents. I really feel strongly that part of how we recover from the pandemic and its psychological, like, aftermath
Mhm.
is we return to a place where parents can tolerate a pretty high level of distress in their teenagers, and parents can help teenagers tolerate a pretty high level of distress in themselves. And I know why we're not there. The pandemic was horrible, but I also feel very strongly that this is part of how we're going to move forward in the
Mm.
most healthy way.
Mm. That's incredible. And that's really one of the themes in the book, The Emotional Lives of Teenagers, your new book, that you talk about living in discomfort and in getting kids to understand that that too is okay. Really powerful. Lisa, I want to also ask about this concept. The way the National Honor Society is selected, it's by your peers, as we discussed. Would the outcome, I can't help but think, the outcome would have been different, Lisa, if it was adults deciding on this. It's probably a good kid. And it sounds like, she's doing everything right. But how do you deal with the fact that this feels like such a popularity competition? And if it was voted by teachers or school administrators, the outcome might have been different.
That's painful, right? And it may have. And the parent may be able to say, look, you and I both know that kid's hosting all the parties or going to all the parties. And, like, people are, they vote for that person because of reasons that have nothing to do with honor. You and I also both know that if the teachers were choosing, there's probably a decent chance you would have gotten the job, right? Like, I mean, I think you could say something kind
Mhm.
like that. But I think the other thing we want to remember is the teachers are watching too. The teachers are probably like, "Oh, man.
I
Like,
didn't think of that.
that's not who we would have chosen." And then I also love the way in which I think the teachers can actually exact some, help find some balance, right? That when they do have say about things, they may put a thumb on the scale for a kid who they think got robbed. I think about the awards at the high school. There's awards
Mhm.
ceremonies. And one of the things I love about schools when they do this is that there's an award that's generic enough that they can decide to give it to anyone who they just think deserves an award. And there are awards like this that, and they're sort of ill-defined.
Mhm.
And I've been to these ceremonies and you're like, okay, that award, like, doesn't really say anything, but, like, yep, that kid deserved an award and the school knew it. And so I would also
Right.
say, I think the takeaway for this and for the parent is, like, to say to the kid, let it play out. Like, play the long game here, right? So yeah, so today did not go the way you wanted to go, but I think these are probably juniors. Like, you got another year in this space. Like, if you do nothing, if you lay low, if you don't stir the pot and, react strongly, leave open the possibility that the scales of justice will be brought back into balance by forces beyond your control. I think
Mm,
I feel like that's often how the world shapes
I
itself.
love that. I
And
love
I
that.
think we can tell kids that too.
Oh, that's really good. That's really good. So to wrap this up, Lisa, going back to this idea of how so many high school seniors are finding out where they're going to end up, and it can be difficult. But when you are helping your children understand unfairness and you're building brick by brick, as we talked about in your new book, their emotional foundation, what should parents keep in mind when talking to them about injustice or unfairness too?
Unfairness. I think a lot of how kids are going to assess this is by seeing how upset we get or don't.
They're
And so
gauging.
I think they're
They're
gauging our
mhm.
reaction. So if the kid comes home and dad's like, yeah, life's not always fair, that stinks, and just can sit in the discomfort with her and bear it, I think she's going to move through it quite a bit more quickly and also grow in her capacity for tolerating discomfort. I think if we react really, really strongly to our kids' unfairnesses, it may feel like a vote of no confidence, right? And not help our kids manage the reality. Like this is just part of life. It's one of the less pleasant parts of life, but it is a part we all have to learn to manage.
It's really beautifully said. What do you have for us for parenting to go?
Okay. So here's, how I said like it's a bad look, to
Yes,
call and
yes.
gripe. I think that's true. But that doesn't mean kids don't get to complain. And so one of the things I think a situation like this allows us to say as parents is like, look, you can be super unhappy about how this went down. And if you want to complain to me about it all day, go for it. Same on, what so many families are dealing with right now where kids didn't get into a college that a kid who that they really wanted to go to and a kid that they're like, why did that kid get in? Right. Like they have so much information on each other. They like can't believe sometimes how this all shakes out. I think it's a good thing to say to your kid, look, you guys know so much, see so much, are dealing with so much stress. If you want to complain to me about how, if you want to bring what are truly sometimes petty complaints to
Mhm,
me
mhm.
about how this shook out, please feel free. Like, I am happy to be a vault. You probably don't want to be doing this in the lunchroom. Like, you probably don't want to be doing this up and down the halls, right? Like, this is a place also where we can help kids build an understanding of the importance of discretion, of not trashing people in places where it will get back to them. Like it just, it's part of being a mature person. It's part of professionalism, right? As we become adults, which doesn't mean we don't complain about people, but we know who to complain to.
That is an important lesson. It's not about complaining. You can complain, but know who to complain it to. I will tell you, I have zero regrets in my life of taking the high road. Never, even though it's been painful and it's not the exit I wanted to take off of the highway, but I have
Yep.
never, ever been disappointed by taking the high road, even though it might not have felt great in the moment. I would rather have
Yep.
taken some other course of action. But long term, it has
Yep.
always worked out.
100%. 100%.
Speaking of roads, next week we're going to talk about whether your child should possibly take a gap year. And you helped me really understand some of the benefits of taking a gap year when my Asian personality of keep going and work hard and don't take a detour, what a difference it can possibly make for your child. I'll see you next week.
See you next week.
Thanks for joining us. Be sure to subscribe to the Ask Lisa podcast so you get the episodes just as soon as they drop. And send us your questions to askLisa@drlisademore.com. And now a word from our lawyers. The advice provided on this podcast does not constitute or serve as a substitute for professional psychological treatment, therapy, or other types of professional advice or intervention. If you have concerns about your child's well-being, consult a physician or mental health professional. If you're looking for additional resources, check out Lisa's website at drlisademore.com. We'll see you next week.